Estamos al aire.
Muy buenos días, soy Daniela Godoy, oficial principal.
Good morning, I'm Daniela Godoy, FAO's Senior Food and Nutrition Security Policy Officer for Latin America and the Caribbean. We would like to welcome everyone who are joining us today for the presentation of the regional overview of Food and Nutrition Security 2021, Statistics and Trends. This publication has been developed since 2009, and it aims to provide an overview of the food and nutrition situation in our region through measuring and monitoring of food and nutrition security indicators in order to promote the formulation and implementation of evidence-based public policies. For the second consecutive year, we will launch this important document online, taking precautions in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. But we also know that this allows us to reach more countries and more people with this overview. This overview includes data and indicators for the region on undernourishment, food insecurity, adult obesity, wasting, stunting, and overweight in children under 5, as well as breastfeeding, prevalence of low birth weight, and anemia in women in reproductive age. I would like to begin by introducing our very important panelists who will be in charge of introducing today's overview for 2021 and to introduce the challenges we face. Mr. Julio Verdeguer, FAO Regional Representative for Latin America and the Caribbean of Mr. Fabrizio Briciani, Regional Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, Ms. Carissa Etienne, Director of PAHO and World Health Organization, Ms. Mikey Arts, Regional Advisor, Survive and Thrive Advisor, UNICEF Latin America and the Caribbean, and Ms. Lola Castro, Regional Director of the United Nations World Food Program for Latin America and the Caribbean. We'd like to greet those who join us in this transmission through FAO's social networks, on Twitter at the @FAOAmericas account, on Facebook on the FAO account in Spanish, and YouTube at FAO and the United Nations website as well. We'd also like to invite you to participate in this broadcasting by commenting on social networks with hashtag Panorama 2021 or hashtag Sin Dejar Nadie Atrás. For journalists participating in today's press conference, we'd like to invite you to send your questions through the Zoom chat directly to Jimena Bravo, all of which will be answered at the end of the presentation and during the time we have available. 5 agencies of the United Nations system have joined forces to publish this year's Panorama 2021 report. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, the Pan American Health Organization and World Health Organization, the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and the World Food Program, WFP. The publication of Panorama 2021 provides updated statistics and trends on the food and nutrition security situation in Latin America and the Caribbean that compel us to pay more attention and move towards the transformation of agri-food systems toward more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable systems for better production, better nutrition, better environment, and a better life, and thus achieve healthy diets for the entire population, leaving no one behind. Today, it is the time now to look at these year's Panorama video.
En 2020, el hambre y la inseguridad alimentaria crecieron en América Latina y el Caribe más que en ninguna otra región del mundo. El hambre ha aumentado en América Latina y el Caribe desde el 2014. El número de personas con hambre en la región pasó de casi 46 millones en el 2019 a casi 60 en el 2020. Es un incremento de casi 14 millones de personas. Estas cifras significan que casi una de cada 10 personas pasó hambre en 2020 en América Latina y el Caribe. En 2020, la inseguridad alimentaria afectó a 267 millones de personas, 60 más que el año anterior. 4 de cada 10 personas se ven afectadas. La inseguridad alimentaria grave, es decir, personas que quedaron totalmente sin alimentos o pasaron al menos un día sin comer, afectó a casi 93 millones de personas en la región, casi el doble que en 2014. Además de la batalla contra el hambre y la inseguridad alimentaria, América Latina y el Caribe está perdiendo la batalla contra otras formas de malnutrición. 106 millones de personas, una de cada 4 personas adultas, sufre de obesidad y están expuestas a enfermedades graves como diabetes, cáncer o enfermedades cardiovasculares. El sobrepeso infantil lleva 20 años en aumento y afecta a casi 4 millones de niños y niñas menores de 5 años. Estos datos son parte del panorama de la seguridad alimentaria y nutricional en América Latina y el Caribe 2021, elaborado conjuntamente por 5 agencias del Sistema de Naciones Unidas. Son también una llamada urgente a la acción. Para revertir esta situación, es necesario transformar nuestros sistemas alimentarios, la forma en que producimos, procesamos, distribuimos y consumimos alimentos. Necesitamos sistemas alimentarios sostenibles e inclusivos que garanticen el acceso a una dieta saludable para todas las personas, sin dejar a nadie atrás.
Thank you, Daniela. I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues of all agencies, funds, and programs under United Nations that have joined in order to prepare this new report on food security and nutrition in our region. The agencies join to collaborate because we face a huge challenge, and it would be impossible to tackle without a collaboration, without coordination, without working hand in hand. And I'd like to thank the press, the media for being with us today. Without the work of mass media, we cannot achieve the zero hunger goal. We need their criticism, their information, their dissemination in order to walk towards this very important goal of the SDGs. As Daniela said, this is the 13th edition of this overview. And I'm going to share some of my slides. And throughout this period, this is the 6th time in which, unfortunately, we must report bad news. Since 2014, our region started walking backwards in the fight against hunger and food insecurity. The pandemic has had a devastating impact over the situation of food and nutrition security in our region. Close to 14 million people have joined the contingent in Latin America of people who live under hunger conditions. The pandemic has worsened the situation, but I'd like to highlight that not everything is due to the pandemic. Since 2014, close to 27 million have been added to the world of those who go to bed every day without being adequately nourished. The setback, if you see these figures, is close to 20 years in the fight against hunger. If we measured by the number of people who are under this condition in 2002, which is the highest point in this series that we've introduced, so we had 58.5 million people living in hunger conditions in the region, and now it's 59.7 million. There's no updated records of when it was the last time we had close to 60 million people living in hunger in our region. Now, in terms of percentage of the population, we see that, except for the Caribbean, that remains quite stable. Both South America and Mesoamerica, this is to say Central America and Mexico, have gone back dramatically in the proportion of the population that live in a condition of hunger. In terms of the entire region, we lost 2 percentage points compared to 2019 during 2020. But 70% of that increase between 2014 and 2020 in terms of population percentage living in this condition. In the 20th century, 21st century in Latin America, in countries with a middle to high income and high income countries, this does not have a possible explanation. Hunger, of course, is one of the most severe forms of food insecurity, but there are other ways of measuring this scourge. One of them is to see what the food insecurity indicators, which are moderate or severe, which is a more direct way of measuring it, because it's based on asking what is the situation through household surveys. The situation of food insecurity, moderate and severe, what it's telling us is that we have 267 million people in this condition in our region. 267 million people over a total of 650 million people of overall population in the region. Approximately 60 million people joined this contingent in 2019, and 113 million more if we look at the situation compared to 2014. The biggest impact or biggest increase is experienced in South America. This is important because sometimes we're not aware that it is in South America where the numbers are more significant. In this report, we also inform that compared to other regions in the world, all the other regions in the world, Latin America and the Caribbean was the one experiencing the largest deterioration in relative terms compared to the population. Food insecurity in this area, moderate and severe, increased by 9 percentage points between 2019 and 20. No other region is close to that, neither Africa nor Asia, regions that are probably poorer than Latin America and the Caribbean, but we in our region have experienced a much more severe impact. I'd like to emphasize, as part of the many figures and analysis that exist in this report, that we want with the agencies and funds and programs to strongly focus on this problem.
Hunger and food insecurity is an additional dimension of gender inequality. The difference in hunger between men and women is unacceptably high. Practically 42% in women compared to a little over 32% among men. Practically 10% difference. And what is even worse is that this gap is on the increase year after year, ever since we started measuring it. It was only 4 percentage points in 2014 and 9.6 percentage points in 2020. We could perhaps even talk of a new expression of violence against women via the deprivation of their right to food. Hunger is not the only expression of food insecurity, as was mentioned by Daniela, and as is outlined in detail in the report. The delay in the growth of boys and girls is, of course, something that attracts the attention of all agencies, governments, and civil society, and quite rightly so. It is an issue that if we were to take a midterm measure, Latin America has increased and has improved and continues to improve, even during the years of the pandemic, in accordance with the data that we can report. However, Over the past few years, we have seen that this process has slowed down every year. We were making headway at a far greater speed, and we are beginning to lose that initial thrust. It is absolutely fundamental for us to once again regain with great strength the struggle against all forms of child malnutrition. Again, this is a scourge that we evidence in all the subregions of Latin America and the Caribbean. Boys and girls are also being impacted by overweight and obesity. It is very difficult to make people understand how these conditions that boys and girls are subjected to, on the one hand, malnutrition, and on the other hand, overweight and obesity, questions the future development of Latin America and the Caribbean, in addition to, of course, to impacting the possibility of each one of these persons if they are inadequately nourished. We have 7.5% of boys and girls in Latin America with overweight. The world average is 2 percentage points below our level. We are truly sacrificing our children with inadequate food and insufficient nutrition. We're not going to reach the SDG in terms of overweight and obesity in boys and girls if we continue along these lines. And if we look at adults, what we have also said in presentations of this same report in previous years is that we continue to suffer an uncontrolled epidemic of obesity among adults. 1 out of every 4 adults suffer from obesity. 1 out of every 4. Let's think 1 out of every 4. I'm not talking of overweight, I'm talking of obesity. What this represents in health terms, in loss of economic growth, in gigantic expenses in the public budget in order to struggle against the consequences of on human health of this uncontrolled epidemic. We're well above the world average, well above 13% at a world level, but 24% in our own region, and the problem continues to worsen at an alarming speed. Now, this is not resolved with only with individual or personal attitudes. What we find is a food system that is not complying with its task of efficiently and healthily feeding everyone. Latin America and the Caribbean produces abundant food, and yet, as you have seen, we have a high percentage of our population suffering from some type of malnutrition or food insecurity. What we need, as has already been mentioned by all agencies in the past, is a transformation of our agri-food systems, a transformation. We're not only talking of individual behaviors here. Now, this has been strongly ratified in the recent summit of food systems summoned by the General Secretary of the United Nations during last September, where all of those that are present here took part together with countries from Latin America and the Caribbean. We begin to become aware that in order to tackle these expressions of malnourishment and food insecurity, we need to transform agri-food systems. In the short term, we want to suggest certain measures, and there are others in the report, but today I would like to highlight 4. It is essential when it comes to tackling hunger problems and severe food insecurity problems to accelerate the process of economic and employment recovery. But it is not enough to have a general economic recovery process in place. We invite governments to take on board specific measures so that during this process of employment and economic recovery, we pay special attention to those initiatives that point or that focus on sectors that are traditionally much more vulnerable, those that evidence the deterioration of their food situation as a result of the pandemic, and we need an additional effort for that purpose. We also believe it's fundamental to continue to support family agriculture and non-industrial fishing. Heroism was evidenced during last year so that we did not run out of food during the pandemic. But those that provide food for us have no social protection, they have no unemployment benefit, they have very fragile systems of access to public health, to credits, and to technical assistance. We have to be concerned with supporting those who put food on our tables. In this sense, it is fundamental also to maintain social protection programs in place, the emergency social protection programs established to tackle the pandemic. As we advance in terms of recovery, countries start to do away with these social protection programs. And we invite all countries to maintain these programs, especially in their nutritional dimension, especially thinking of families that have been most strongly hit in terms of food insecurity as a result of the pandemic. And we're talking here of cash transfers, of food assistance, of support for school meals, and so on and so forth. And finally, we believe it is also necessary, given the figures that we have presented, to make a very significant effort in each country in the region in order to expand coverage and improve the nutritional quality of school food programs. We never get tired of repeating that we have more than 180 million boys and girls that receive school meals, and many are still left out. And 10 million of those, this is for them, this is their main meal of the day, and therefore we have to improve the nutritional quality of these programs in order to tackle malnutrition, overweight, and obesity problems among boys and girls. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Julio Verdeguer, for presenting the statistics and trends that reveal that today it is more important than ever to move from strategies to action. To continue, I will offer the floor to Fabricio Bresciane, who is a regional economist for Latin America and the Caribbean of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Good morning, dear host, Julio Verdeguer, Lola Castro, dear Fernando Leanes, dear professionals, journalists who accompany us today. First of all, I'd like to convey the greetings of Lozana Polana, Director of Latin America and the Caribbean, who unfortunately is not able to be with us here today. On behalf of the whole of our organization, first of all, I would like to say that we're very pleased to be here once again, participating in the regional panorama of food and nutritional insecurity in Latin America and the Caribbean. Focusing this year on data and statistics that reflect the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic of food and nutritional insecurity in the region. As has been said by Julio, this is alarming data. The figures that have been presented in this report place the region even further from the possibility of achieving sustainable development goals, especially the goal of zero hunger by 2030. We are also aware that hunger and food insecurity are intrinsically related to poverty and inequality, and in consequence have a more severe impact on vulnerable populations such as small farmers, rural populations, indigenous populations, and Afro-descendant populations. So the COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly had a devastating effect upon our region, and this registers an increase in hunger and food insecurity, which is much more pronounced than any other other region in the world, as we have just seen. But we cannot forget that hunger has been on the increase since 2014, as was mentioned by Julio, in our region. And this reflects that before COVID-19, our food systems were failing in terms of their basic purpose, which is to guarantee access to a healthy diet to all people. The reports of these figures are an urgent call to action so that we can reverse the situation. What we need is a profound transformation of our food systems so that they may be much more sustainable and inclusive, and enable all people to have to receive a quality food. In order to respond to this situation, the UN system has recently promoted the Summit on Food Systems, which was held in New York last September. Years before the summit, we issued a report on rural development, which included a whole series of fundamental recommendations to advance towards that system. First of all, to invest in small farming ventures and rural SMEs that respond processing and distribution of food. Secondly, access to innovations such as solutions based on nature and agroecology in order to adapt the production of small farmers to climate change. Three, to develop systems of price fixation for agricultural products that reflect the real cost of production and that guarantee a just retribution to small farmers. Four, to rethink the present concentration of power in food systems, changing regulations and trade agreements, enabling the rural population of developing countries to benefit from that. And finally, food markets must be accessible to the rural population and in fair conditions. It doesn't make sense that those that produce food suffer from hunger. At present, our associate president said that we know we have to change so that trading and the consumption of food is fair and sustainable, and thus to have nutritional food and accessible to everyone. Now, what we need is investments and the political will to act. The figures of this report reveal that those investments and that political willingness are increasingly necessary. Our experience mentions that we have to place at the very center of this transformation of food systems small farmers who produce more than 1/3 of the food that we consume. We must also ensure that the gender gap does not deepen. Women have been especially impacted by COVID-19, given the increase of their burden of work in terms of care and their high dependence on informal work. Young people and women are key actors, key stakeholders for the transformation of food systems. And thus, we have to make sure that they are not left behind in our task of eradicating hunger and food insecurity in our region. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention.
We'd like to thank Ms. Bresciani, and we'd like to remind you, journalists joining us today during the press conference, that we can receive your questions through the Zoom chat and internally into Ximena Bravo, who will be answered at the end of the presentation. Let's now continue with a presentation by Carissa Etienne, Director of PAHO, World Health Organization, who sent a video with her remarks.
PAHO is pleased to be part of the regional overview of food security and nutrition 2021. This joint UN report calls for urgent actions to counter the rise in hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition in all its forms in the region of the Americas. Optimal nutrition is essential for all throughout the life course. This report reveals a worrying rise in the rates of hunger and poverty that prevent people from enjoying essential rights. Despite the effort of many countries in the region, malnutrition in all its forms, including increasing rates of obesity and overweight, continues to threaten the health and well-being of our populations. In recent years, several factors have resulted in the delay or even reversal of efforts to eradicate hunger, food insecurity, and all forms of malnutrition by 2030. The root of many of the most pressing threats to human, animal, and planetary health have been unhealthy, inequitable, and unsustainable food systems. The COVID-19 pandemic has only made these situations worse, reducing household food security, availability, and affordability of healthy food, and access to essential nutritional services. 4 out of every 10 people in the region, 267 million, experience moderate or severe food insecurity in 2020, 60 million more than in 2019. In addition, overweight in children has been increasing over the past 20 years, and in 2020, 3.9 million children, 7.5% of children under 5 years of age, were overweight, almost 2 percentage points above the world average. At the same time, the progress in reducing stunting in children and anemia in women of reproductive age has slowed, particularly affecting populations living in vulnerable conditions in the region. PAHO provides guidance and tools that can help policy and decision makers to deliver impact across food systems for better human, animal, and planetary health. PAHO also supports strengthening of primary healthcare systems to institutionalize and scale up essential nutrition actions through a life course approach, including the support for breastfeeding and infant and young child feeding, feeding of low birth weight infants, growth monitoring, assessment and management of wasting, micronutrient supplementation, school food policies, obesity prevention, salt reduction, elimination of industrially produced trans fatty acids, nutritional care during pregnancy and postpartum, nutritional care during infections, nutrition in emergencies, and nutrition for older adults and persons living with specific conditions. That means leaving no one behind. With technical assistance from PAHO, many of the countries in the Americas are adopting regulations which are consistent with the PAHO Plan of Action for the prevention of obesity in children and adolescents. These include improved school food and physical activity environments, taxation of sugar-sweetened beverages, front-of-package warning labels, and regulation of the marketing of foods to children. Furthermore, PAHO supports countries in policies to promote healthier diets by reducing salt consumption and eliminating industrially produced trans fats from the food supply. As countries focus on building back better following the COVID-19 pandemic, it is critical that attention be paid to sustainable food systems that guarantee food security and nutrition for all, so that economic, social, and environmental conditions are not compromised in the future. It is time to get our food systems right. And this is the time to scale up action on nutrition as we reach the halfway point of the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition. We must prioritize human and planetary health and strengthen our commitment to meet the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 2 and SDG 3, guarantee good health and well-being. Indeed, the well-being of every human and indeed animal depends on the global food system. And we all have a responsibility to build a world in which no one is hungry, no one is unhealthy from a preventable cause, and no one faces poverty, and indeed that no one is left behind.
Ahora vamos a dar la palabra a la señora Maike Arts, asesora regional.
Now we're going to offer the floor to Maike Arts. She's the regional director of the United Nations World Food Program for Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Dear regional directors and colleagues of FAO, IFDA, PAHO, and World Food Programs, and the media representatives. We'd like to thank FAO for coordinating this work that shows us the status of food security and nutrition security in the region today. At UNICEF, we are specifically concerned for the situation of boys, girls, and teenagers because of the impact of food and malnutrition in themselves, and boys, girls, and teenagers, and their effects on the other stages of their lives. It is encouraging that the prevalence of the stunting is lowering, but we cannot lower our guard because the speed is also lowering, the speed of that reduction in stunting. The overview shows us that there are significant inequalities, as we heard, in the prevalence of malnutrition in all its forms. Those who live in rural areas, families with limited resources, women, and the indigenous and Afro-descendant population suffer the most in terms of the different forms of malnutrition. The growth of overweight is a specific concern in children below 5 years. The prevalence is 7.5%, as we saw, and in the case of teenagers and boys, girls, and teenagers between 5 and 19 years of age, is close to 30%. So this is risk to health and long-term well-being, and it also has an economic impact on countries. In order to change the situation, we must improve food environments and to change the situation from an early age. For example, improving the support and protection of breastfeeding and the diversity of the diet for boys and girls, young boys and girls. It is also key to establish and to monitor legal frameworks that are relevant to regulate the promotion of healthy food, as we have already heard. So it is important to improve food security, also considering the quality of the diets. COVID-19 showed us the challenges in order to keep a healthy diet. We at UNICEF ran a poll among teenagers from 13 to 19 years of age in 8 countries in 2020 and 21. The respondents informed that in both years it was more difficult to find healthy food compared to before the COVID, mainly because of having limited resources, because families had less money to buy it, and also due to the COVID-19 situation. And also half of the respondents also reduced their physical activity, and women more than men. What's interesting in this survey is that teenagers had many suggestions in order to achieve a solution for the situation. For example, they suggested that governments could regulate the price of healthy diets, regulate the price of not healthy food, and to expand the infrastructure and spaces for the community in order to have more access to physical activity. They also suggested to improve nutritional advisory and to apply different communication strategies through media or interpersonal communications and through platforms such as TV, social media, and the school. Those are key contributions that we've just heard in order to improve the environments, but also specifically for boys, girls, and teenagers specifically. So, and this is also a specific recommendation. So it is a task for all of us in the public sector and also in the private sector to cater to this request from the region, and so that healthy food is available and that it is accessible to all families especially the most vulnerable ones now when it seems that we are coming out of the most acute phase of the pandemic. At UNICEF, we keep our commitment. If we will continue to support governments in the region to strengthen food systems, also health care systems in the region, and of water and sanitation in collaboration with the rest of the United Nations agencies and other partners, so that together we end food insecurity and malnutrition in all its forms. That's the only way in which we can guarantee the right of all boys and girls and teenagers to grow healthily in spite of the difficulties that have worsened in the context of COVID. Let's not leave anyone behind. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Arts, for reminding us the importance of placing boys and girls at the center of all these actions. Finally, we will hear the remarks by Lola Castro, Regional Director of the United Nations World Food Program for Latin America and the Caribbean. Good morning, everyone, and our colleagues Julio, Fabricio, Carissa, and Mikey, and all the media that are present. It is an honor to be with you in presenting the relevant points of this overview 2021. And I believe we've heard almost everything, but I'd like to try to emphasize certain aspects that haven't been raised so far that may add some content. So we have heard also that after decades of a ongoing reduction in the number of people suffering from hunger, this has increased in 2014 onwards, with almost 80% of increase in the prevalence of undernutrition in the last 6 years, as we saw in the first slides. And this the report of the overview for 2021 shows how COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the scenario and sets us back from the commitments we had in terms of reducing hunger and malnutrition for 2030. Unfortunately, we see how Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the regions that has been most affected by COVID-19, and it has caused really a significant GDP contraction in the region of 9.1% in 2020. And we heard how in the Latin American and Caribbean region, there are 267 million people who experienced food insecurity, either moderate or severe in 2020, which is a major concern as World Food Program. The region has problems in reducing prevalence of malnutrition because of multiple external causes that we've heard about, climate shocks, but also internal problems such as low productivity and supply chains that are not very efficient that existed during the pandemic and the lockdowns during COVID, as most evident. All of these elements generate an increase in the cost of nutritious food, and combined with low income, they're reducing the access of everyone to a healthy diet, which is a significant concern we have. In fact, the cost of a nutritious diet and healthy diet in Latin America and the Caribbean is right now the highest in the world, with something that we do not know, but it's a daily cost of $4 per individual. And consequently, this means that 113 million people do not have access to an adequate diet in Latin America and the Caribbean. Based on the cost and the millions of people who do not have access to nutritious food, the increase of malnutrition, as it was said by Mike, is truly very concerning, and in all its forms of malnutrition. We have WFP and ECLAC have conducted studies about the cost of the double burden of malnutrition in 7 countries in the region, and it has been shown that there are significant economic costs associated to these double burden malnutrition. These costs are between 4 and 16% of the GDP of the countries that were in the study, and really all those losses could be avoided through good interventions.
It is clear, as we have said, that we need action in order to ensure access to a healthy and sustainable diet and to ensure the food and nutritional security of people. We spoke of native populations of Afro descendants, but we also need to prevent malnutrition in all shapes for all people. Now, these actions we want to suggest that should consider 4 basic systems: health, food, social protection, and education. And all this throughout people's life cycle, and especially ensuring that we reduce the gender gap in all these aspects. And to conclude, I would just like to mention that in 2020, as we mentioned, in the three countries of the region, provided social transfers to many, many million people that were impacted with the strong socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. But these social transfers have been reduced during 2021 as a result of a limited fiscal scope. But it is clear that social protection platforms represent an excellent opportunity in order to funnel intersectorial support so that countries can reach zero hunger and struggle against malnutrition by 2030. And we hope that how jointly with our colleagues from the UN system here, we aim towards comprehensive resolution of this. And in order to achieve this, integrating sustainable food security, to achieve social security sensitive to nutrition and adaptable to emergencies, and thus mitigate the impact of disasters upon the most vulnerable populations of Latin America and the Caribbean. In other words, we can do this, but together. Thank you very much. And that's as far as I would like to go, Daniel. Thank you. We thank the directors and representatives of the UN agencies that have been part of this presentation. And we will now proceed to the press conference. First of all, we would like to thank the high interest of the press in the contents of our report, and the questions will be answered by the technical teams of the agencies, depending on the topics to be covered. We will begin with a first question, which says, with regards to the COVID crisis, what are the actions in order to resolve these figures? What is it that governments can do? And what is it that the private sector can do? This is asked by Alejandra from Peru. And we will offer the floor to our colleague Leo Nerven, who will respond on behalf of the Pan American Health Organization. Thank you very much. A greeting to you all from PAHO. I don't know whether everyone has been able to hear the message of Dr. Etienne, but in any case, she has stated that we continue to lose the battle against all forms of malnutrition, and that we are very far from ensuring safe nutrition, safe food for everyone. And if we want to end hunger and provide healthy and healthy lives and well-being to all the people in the Americas, we have to transform our agricultural and food systems in order to provide healthy food for everyone, leaving no one behind. So we are concerned with the increase of all types of malnutrition as a result of COVID. We have evidenced an increase in malnutrition and food insecurity, and also overweight and obesity and disease have increased. And this is a risk factor which is even greater and that can have serious consequences as a result of COVID-19. This has also been linked to a higher consumption of ultra-processed food during the pandemic and less physical activity. So, in actual fact, we have to, first of all, guarantee availability and access to nutritional food and promote the sustainable production of food. Also, we need to create a food context which is much more healthy and in which it becomes easier to obtain healthy foods, and where we do away through regulations, the consumption of fatty foods and so on. We also must ensure the continuity of nutritional services and development among children, and especially among pregnant women and among children aged less than 5 years old, to promote breastfeeding, to comply with the international code for the publicity of the advantages of breastfeeding. We must support social protection programs and also guide health programs in schools. Uh, the Pan American Health Organization is working intensively on that through our action plan for the prevention of overweight and obesity among teenagers through universal health coverage and also at an international level. We are launching a global strategy against obesity, which is one of the indicators that has achieved less progress. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for your answer. We now have a second question from Francisco from Argentina. Why do you believe that we have evidenced a bigger increase of hunger and food insecurity in Latin America and the Caribbean compared to the rest of the world? And this on representing FIDA, Mrs. Lola Castro will answer this question. I will answer on behalf of the welfare program, but it doesn't matter. We're all the same. Yes, please excuse me. Don't worry, Daniela. No, but that's okay. I hope that that they that, that they also have the same opinion as myself. But as mentioned by Julio, we have seen how in the region, since 2014, we have seen an acceleration of the number of people suffering from severe food insecurity. And why? Well, basically because we have seen how, despite the fact that the region produces a large amount of food, and despite the fact that there is enough food for all the population, there's no access to this population on the part of everyone in society. And this is due to a very expensive diet that is not accessible to people living in poverty. And that is why we have said that many of the solutions that we can resort to and that we have worked with governments in this and also with UN agencies is social protection transfers that enable people to gain access to an adequate basic diet at all moments, and especially during crises periods. Obviously, with the COVID-19 situation, that situation became exacerbated because people with mid-income who beforehand could gain access to a basic and adequate basket lost that possibility because of loss of income. And we hope that with economic recovery, some part of the population will be able to regain access to food. But we must also quickly promote actions to ensure that social systems not only provide the adequate transfers so that people may have a basic diet, but also with nutritional indicators that enable that basic diet to be nutritionally adequate in order to prevent the problems that have been mentioned by Michael and other problems in terms of obesity and malnutrition. That's as far as I would like to go. Thank you. Thank you. We also have a question from Colombia, from Sebastian, who asks, well, the world transport crisis for goods has been a problem when it comes to food provision in Latin America. Isabel de la Peña will answer that question. Good morning. Thank you very much, Daniela. Well, from FIAT, we believe that all factors have had an influence. So the crisis of the transport of goods has undoubtedly had an impact upon food supply chains and in consequence on prices of food. And this is especially relevant in our region because, as mentioned by the regional director, this is the region of the world with the most costly diet. And this was so before the COVID-19 crisis. And this crisis has exacerbated the problem, placing nutritional food beyond the reach of millions of people in our region. But we believe from FIDA and from our other agencies and the agencies that participated in this report, that these figures that have been presented reflect a far more in-depth and pre-existing problem, a problem that existed before the crisis. Hunger has been on the increase since 2014, and we believe that what this reflects is that food systems are failing in their basic purpose of providing quality food for the population, and we need a strong willingness on the part of all stakeholders in order to become the most sustainable. And for that purpose, we have to work on all links of the chain, beginning with small producers, but also with small and medium-sized enterprises that work in processing, storage, transport, production, and trading of food, working so that all these links are much more sustainable and inclusive, and reporting their resilience before faced with shocks such as the crisis of the transport of goods or the pandemic. So that is the call to action that is also relevant. Thank you very much, Isabel. We also have a question from Maria Jose from Chile. How do you explain the double burden of malnutrition in our region with high figures of both hunger and obesity? UNICEF will answer. Mike Yats. Thank you. This is a very important question, and I believe that many people will be asking themselves the same question. There are two aspects here, what we call the double burden of malnutrition. Normally, we refer with this to having chronic malnutrition, delay in growth, at the same time as overweight and other expressions of malnutrition. But as mentioned by this lady, we also have hunger and overweight. And these two things seem to be contradictory. But what happens is that many of the causes are the same. A child that is born underweight at birth has a greater risk of being overweight because his or her body is not so capable of processing the food that he or she receives, and if subsequently he or she receives food with high carbohydrates and without the necessary diversity of the diet, there is a risk. The risk of becoming overweight is greater, and therefore the causes that are related to poverty, to inequalities, can lead us to evidence malnutrition, delay in growth, but at the same time overweight. And with these two expressions, the diet during the first years of life, breastfeeding, diversity of diet, which includes vegetables, fruit, and many other food, leads us to prevent delay in growth and also to prevent overweight. And as we already heard, it helps us we need to prevent ultra-processed food because that helps us to reduce obesity and also reduce delay in growth because this food has no nutrients, and what we need is to have a diet, a diversity of diets with real food. And so it seems to be a contribution, but in actual fact, we have to work on the causes of food insecurity and malnutrition as from the very first years of life, and also taking into consideration inequalities. And lastly, an element that I would like to mention here is the care crisis, or the crisis of care that came across very strongly during the pandemic, because in most families it is women who have to make sure that the family is fed, but they also have to ensure income and make sure that children attend virtual school. And this is another factor, risk factor, that increases malnutrition if we don't provide support for social protection systems in order to achieve to obtain values with a nutritional value. So we have to focus on the causes of all forms of malnutrition, including food insecurity. Thank you. Thank you. We have received an additional question where they ask about the COVID crisis. What would be the actions in order to resolve these figures as from the private sector? Julio Verdeguer will answer this question. Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you very much for the question. And this question is very important. because the agri-food system is a system which involves primarily private stakeholders, traders, transporters, workers in wholesale markets, in supermarkets, and all of us as consumers. So the action of the private stakeholders and of markets is crucial. It is fundamental. There can be no transformation of agri-food systems without private companies of all sizes if they don't start to modify their strategies to be innovations and so on.
Governments, of course, must generate the regulatory frameworks, the incentives, and the public policy signals to induce to urge the private sector to change the way in which they transport, produce, market, sell, and consume food. So it is a job of the governments to establish this framework that will allow for this shift in the way in which the agri-food system operates in Latin America and the Caribbean today. But definitely, many of the actions will have to be adopted by the private sector. We also believe that the private sector has a key role to play in facing the shorter term effects of COVID that we have alluded to when comparing the figures for 2020 and 2019. Let me insist again, the job generation, job creation is key, especially job creation in a private sector that many times we forget that exists, which are the hundreds and thousands of small and medium enterprises that operate in an informal context. It is key, absolutely key, to support all those businesses that are part of the agri-food system by the hundreds of thousands and who require incentives, support of the government in order to reactivate, to hire people back and help solve these very huge food insecurity problems. Thank you. Thank you. We have a question. The youth seem to aim at the fact that a healthy diet in our countries is expensive, $4 per person. What can we do about it? We'll ask UNICEF, Mikey, to answer that. Thank you. Really, I think we need to think that the youth, the teenagers can still live with their parents, but there are young people who have their own families, and maybe some solutions are different because of that. But there are different measures that are relevant. One is the social protection in terms of money transfers, cash transfers for the people who need it. But at the same time, what can be relevant as well is support at a more systemic level, support for producers and also support in order to control prices. There are different measures that can be adopted that can be applied to stimulate and reduce prices to a significant level. Of course, there are many families who need it. But it's good today, together with those social protection measures at the level of the families that need it, is also to support it with some kind of information or education about healthy diet, so that we can support them with helping them choose the healthiest food. But what's important is sustainable measures that can be applied for a long period of time, either nationally or with an emphasis on the families that need it the most. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. We have a question from Argentina. How to develop a price management in an economy with severe inflation? Fabrizio Brecciani from IFD will respond. Thank you for the question. The issue of how prices are, food prices are impacting in terms of inflation. I think it's something absolutely relevant. We need to understand the dynamic before starting to understand the measures that we need to apply in order to control the phenomenon. There are four elements one must consider in that regard in terms of price inflation that is being experienced in terms of food today. First is that inflation is something that is prior to COVID advent, and there's been cases of clashes that have happened or shocks in other regions. For example, um, swine food in China that prior to COVID caused a shock of the price in the food associated to swine, to pork meat. Second, at the beginning of the COVID, the interventions that were made in order to control COVID have had an impact, though transient, on the price of food. Third, the transportation costs that has been growing is also contributing to increased prices of food worldwide and also in each region. And fourth, there is a long-term tension over the food prices that is being applied. And on this, we would need to be more careful in terms of what's going on with food storage, especially grains, because we will go back time, thinking of the price crisis of 2008. One of the factors of that crisis was a constant and drop or reduction in the storage of grain. So there are several factors that are acting, that are playing a role that may generate some stresses in the food markets in terms of the prices of food and to contribute to inflationary practices that are more specific to each one of the countries. In this specific case, Argentina. Thank you, Mr. Bresciani, for your answer. We keep getting questions, so thank you very much for the interest. This question says that in prior years, we've also seen that women in the region had worse food security indicators. What are the structural actions that can be adopted to respond to this crisis? I'm going to offer the floor to Ms. Lola Castro to answer this. Thank you. And clearly, Mr. Verdaguer's presentation, it was really clear, this gender gap, and that gender gap is significant in Latin America and the Caribbean. How can we close that gap and make sure that women have access to food equally or on the same level, or so that there is at least equality in terms of food security for women? We must focus on making sure that all projects, social protection programs, resilience programs, employment programs, and different nutritional programs should have a gender approach, that we should look at women, and not only women, but also, as it was mentioned, marginalized populations, the ones that carry the burden of malnutrition in our countries, and of indicators such as Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples. We must emphasize on the fact that they should receive a priority, they should be prioritized so that cater to women on a differentiated manner to women, especially when they are the heads of the households or those who carry the burden of care and work. That is to say, we need to look at this with a gender lens that actually clarifies the priorities in the case of vulnerable groups, in this case, women, in order to close that gap. Thank you. We'll continue with the questions. What are the actions of FAO with the food industry in the case of sugars, high sodium foods. What has been the issue in Chile with the labeling legislation? Mr. Verdeguer will answer. Thank you. Chile is a country that has played a leadership role regionally and worldwide in terms of regulation of foods that are quite high in this number of critical ingredients, such as the ones that were mentioned in the question. But it is not only Chile. I'd like to say that in several countries, we have been working jointly with PAHO, WHO, and with UNICEF to help the development of similar legislation, labeling legislation, taxes on sweetened beverages. Argentina has just adopted legislation recently, Uruguay, Peru, Mexico, and there are several countries that have joined this movement. Now, we are especially interested on a regulation that generates incentives to consumers so that we prefer other foods and not these ones that have the labels, but which is also very important, that should also incentivize companies to reformulate their food preparations so that they actually place on shelves in supermarkets healthier food with lower sodium, less calories, and fewer calories, and lower sugar. That's key. And scientific evidence shows that that is being achieved in countries like Chile. Not only consumers are modifying our consumption patterns, but many businesses start seeing that there's a major opportunity, market opportunity of doing good business if they start offering healthier food to the population. This is a trend that will keep on growing, and we are interested in helping companies to do this transition. Regulation, yes, but also regulation that actually act as an incentive to businesses. We've done studies here in Chile looking at what happens with the business results of companies, what happens with jobs in those companies. And very rigorous evidence tells us that there's no negative effect on the economic bottom lines of companies because of the application of these regulations. Actually, the opposite. A new market opportunity opens up because there's a population that is eager to buy safer food, healthier food, nutritious food at a price that can be afforded. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll go now to the last question. This question will be answered by World Health Organization, PAHO. What is the risk percentage for the health of women who live in food insecurity in Latin America? Yes, really, as it was said before, food insecurity affect a larger number of people, specifically the health of women is at stake. So we can say, for example, of anemia in fertile age women, as we have seen in this panorama, it affects 17.2% of women, and particularly in rural areas and more vulnerable areas where it's more difficult to have access, indigenous populations and Afro-descendant populations. So food insecurity is not only the lack or low quantity of food, but it is also a problem of food quality. So if food doesn't have much iron, it's not very diversified, there may be significant problems. We see that also food that is high in fat and sugar or salt, it's also more expensive. So there's a significant effect on health and of women themselves, and also on their pregnancy and of the health of the children. So these problems continue in the future because of during the course of life. And maybe to add regarding the last question about reformulation that WHO launched a first set of goals in order to reduce salt, regional goals in 2015. There's been significant progress, but still, a month ago, these goals were updated for the region. So we are willing to work with the countries jointly with the United Nations system in implementing these goals and also in the implementation of our action plan for the elimination of trans fatty acids of industrial production.
Thank you very much for that answer. We would like to thank everyone that has accompanied us today, invite you to review the report and all the material at the FAO webpage and the web pages of the agencies that participated today. Thank you very much, everyone.
En 2020, el hambre y la inseguridad alimentaria crecieron en América Latina y el Caribe más que en ninguna otra región del mundo. El hambre ha aumentado en América Latina y el Caribe desde el 2014. El número de personas con hambre en la región pasó de casi 46 millones en el 2019 a casi 60 en el 2020. Es un incremento de casi 14 millones de personas. Estas cifras significan que casi 1 de cada 10 personas pasó hambre en 2020 en América Latina y el Caribe. En 2020, la inseguridad alimentaria afectó a 267 millones de personas, 60 más que el año anterior. 4 de cada 10 personas se ven afectadas. La inseguridad alimentaria grave, es decir, personas que quedaron totalmente sin alimentos o pasaron al menos un día sin comer, afectó a casi 93 millones de personas en la región, casi el doble que en 2014. Además de la batalla contra el hambre y la inseguridad alimentaria, América Latina y el Caribe está perdiendo la batalla contra otras formas de malnutrición. 106 millones de personas, 1 de cada 4 personas adultas, sufre de obesidad y están expuestas a enfermedades graves como diabetes, cáncer o enfermedades cardiovasculares. El sobrepeso infantil lleva 20 años en aumento y afecta a casi 4 millones de niños y niñas menores de 5 años. Estos datos son parte del panorama de la seguridad alimentaria y nutricional en América Latina y el Caribe 2021, elaborado conjuntamente por 5 agencias del Sistema de Naciones Unidas. Son también una llamada urgente a la acción. Para revertir esta situación, es necesario transformar nuestros sistemas alimentarios, la forma en que producimos, procesamos, distribuimos y consumimos alimentos. Necesitamos sistemas alimentarios sostenibles e inclusivos que garanticen el acceso a una dieta saludable para todas las personas, sin dejar a nadie atrás.